One of the things that made me the most excited about having you join us is your theory on racism.
Yeah.
In fact, I had a bit of a challenge with it. I had to really think about the word racism and how you were describing it
Yeah.
in broadening the meaning of the word. I think you really challenged contemporary thinking. In fact, your definition of racism is one that says that we're all racist, and it's more of a universal human behavior to see things and categorize them by race and what the differences are. But I love the fact that you say in order to be a racist, you actually have to then do something with that information. And you can actually be neutral about it. You can be malignant and actually go towards oppressing or gaining some social, economic, or political advantage, or you can be an anti-racist. Can you flush out your theory for us and share how do you think that this is being a catalyst for more people to be anti-racist?
Yeah, so actually, I have slides I'd like to share if it's okay, in essentially talking about this very topic. Um, Allow me to share this with you.
Yeah,
So,
that'd be great.
essentially, can you see my screen here?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, great. So, essentially, the layperson definition of racism is usually some form of racism encompasses prejudice, discrimination. It's the act of treating people differently on the basis of their the race, and usually in a negative context. And so, this is in Merriam-Webster dictionary. This is in the Common Cultural Lexicon. And so, believe it or not, most people then are synonymizing racism with bigotry. And while this can be partially true, it leads to a fundamental misunderstanding of the power and the scope and the complexities of racism. And so I would argue and I contend that actually racism needs to be fundamentally reconceptualized, even down to the very basic definition of racism. I would contend that the definition of racism should be something like the ability to distinguish and categorize people based on a generally agreed upon understanding of race. Now, on the surface, this seems very shallow. It almost seems like unnecessary. But actually, as we unpack this definition, it actually opens up for more nuanced discussions of race. Because when I show you the theoretical framework here, this model, in which I am positioning racism as a neutral capacity. Okay. So as I've said, it's just the ability to distinguish and categorize people, right? And that on its own is benign. It's neutral. It's just like your ability to identify the difference between a Fuji apple and a Granny Smith apple. You see the color, you see the distinction, you know the difference, and being able to categorize these two apples doesn't really make you a bad person. It doesn't automatically make you a bigot. Okay. So what happens is then our ability to label and categorize people. You're black, you're Asian, you're Hispanic, you're white, you're et cetera, et cetera. This is a kind of benign racism. In essence, we're not really harming anybody. We're also not giving preferential advantage to people simply because we can see and recognize their difference. But this does, in fact, make us racist. One of the ways I could demonstrate this to you is back when I was at the University of Washington, I was living in Seattle. My wife and I would regularly go to the Safeway store, and it was centered near this Ethiopian community. And because my wife is biracial, she happens to be half black and half Filipino. She appears on the surface to be Ethiopian. So many Ethiopian people would approach her speaking their language, Amharic, I believe it is, and then she wouldn't know how to respond. And they would look at her with this, how do you not know your own language kind of thing? Because on the surface, they're racially profiling her, not understanding that she doesn't actually resemble, identify, relate to their culture at all. This is a kind of benign racism. They are using racism to categorize my wife in this way. Well, this still doesn't necessarily say anything about systems of oppression or reducing those systems of oppression. The downstream next step is after you are able to identify people on the basis of their difference, how are you then treating them? And so I would position that this is a kind of malignant racism or traditional racism, and traditional in the historical context, in which now we're talking about the layperson definition of racism, the production of racial inequality, right? Disadvantaging people, racially segregating them in terms of residential areas or admissions to college, or just who you let in a restaurant or something like that. The production of inequality that is based on selective differences, right? And we all know what institutional racism is, I'm assuming, right? We all know what systemic racism is, and these are the negative forms of it. So now that we understand that racism is actually a neutral capacity, well, how do we go about resolving these issues? This has been a common question of exploration for decades. And most people really don't know how to substantively answer that. So for me, I wanted to scientifically model racism in such a way that I could identify its fundamental weak points and then work to dismantle it. And what I found is that, in essence, in order to dismantle racial inequality, you actually still need racism, right? You need to be able to intentionally cultivate inequality, or excuse me, I misspoke. You need to be able to intentionally cultivate equality, which will, in essence, require a kind of racial selection. Okay. So now we're not necessarily talking about the production of racial disparities, but rather the reduction of racial disparities. And in its appropriate context, the reduction of racial disparities is actually just equality, right? There is a reduced difference between people belonging to different groups, racial groups, right? So this is where we're describing anti-racism, which is in essence a kind of moral racism, a kind of ethical racism, in which, yeah, perhaps for specific institutional bodies. Maybe we're looking at the production of racial inequality in home ownership or housing. Maybe we're looking at the inequality patterns of health disparities. Maybe we're looking at wealth disparities. We can see that there are race pattern differences, and then we can intentionally address those with the goal being to bring these points of disparity to a point of statistical convergence, right? And so this has been thrown under the bus and essentially ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court as being fundamentally racist and therefore bad. And the reality is that we need to be able to distinguish bigotry from racism. Everybody's racist. Everybody has a part to play. We all see those differences, but it turns out we can't actually get to a fair, just, and equal society on accident. We have to be intentional about those things. And I think this theoretical model opens up for us to have more nuanced discussion, but also deeper exploration. Because now I could ask you, what does systemic anti-racism look like? What does an institutional anti-racism look like? And in essence, to condense down my point, to give you back the mic, you could think of this as look at the moral context of racism, right? This is a moral contextual framework, right? Where we're saying we know that there are African American alumni association scholarships and scholarships for LGBTQI individuals, and we don't necessarily identify these things as bad because they're seeking to reform patterns of marginalization and injustice. And yet they're still intentionally selective for specific groups. In essence, they're kind of anti-racist or pro-justice, right? And so we need to start thinking about racism in this way, but also applying it in ways that allow us to cultivate visible, substantive change.
So when I first started watching you on Instagram and heard this theory, my immediate reaction was, I'm not racist. And how can you possibly come up with any kind of definition that puts me in a position where I can oppress anyone else, right? However, the other thing that it did is it gave me a way forward when someone says, I don't see color. Because if being being a particular race is actually a made-up construct, right? We actually are not a different species, right? We don't have that level of difference within us. Why would I then want to be continually racialized? And the only reason is because I need you to understand the system of oppression that I'm operating under and how that is playing out on me. Similar to, I need men to understand what sexism is and to see women as different so that they can pay attention and see not only when they are over-sexualizing or being misogynist against a woman, but so that they can see when their peers are and they can play a role in dismantling that. So